Once they got inside the network, the microsegmentation that they had done really didn't. They put things on different IP addresses and they put it on different VLANs, but they didn't restrict the traffic between anything. So as soon as they got access to the network, they had access to everything.
If you listen to our recent episode on why Zero Trust isn't a product you can buy off the shelf, this one is the sequel. Because once you accept that Zero Trust isn't magic salt that you sprinkle on your network, the obvious next question is, okay, then what? In this episode, I sit down again with Michael Blake, technical fellow at OWL Cyber Defense, where he helps secure some of the most sensitive US and global government and defense systems. He specializes in Zero Trust, cross-domain solutions, and network segmentation, and building architectures that hold up in the real world. We walk through 5 concrete steps to actually implementing Zero Trust, starting with inventorying what's really on your network, including the hardware and closets that nobody budgeted for. We talk about microsegmentation, shrinking the blast radius, managing privilege creep, and why Zero Trust in a box can still leave you wide open once an attacker gets inside. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. VLANs without enforcement are just very polite suggestions. This episode is about budgeting, talent, AI risk, and why Zero Trust is less a product and more an operational discipline. You said the first step 1 to Zero Trust is knowing what you actually have on your network. And I shared with you, I don't even know what's in my cupboards. So it sounds really obvious. And it also, I realize the reality of how hard it is, especially when you start thinking about shadow IT. So can you share a real world example where you helped do this discovery, or of an organization that did this discovery? And if you discovered something really good, I want to know about that too.
Yeah, so my experience is in the Department of War, so it's from that lens that I've seen this happen. So at one of the COCOMs, they did an inventory of what was on the network. And so there are many acquisition cycles, decades of hardware there. And they did have money for modernization to replace the old equipment, but it was spread out across the different organizations. There, one branch of the military ran the switches, another branch of the military ran the unified communications infrastructure, the phones and things like that. And so they got so much money for their piece, but then when they went out and started inventorying things, they found in closets, behind walls, legacy equipment, and it wasn't on anybody's inventory list. It needed to be replaced, but it wasn't budgeted for. So there was a lot of finger pointing and I would say passionate discussions about who was going to pay to replace that equipment, which budget it was going to come out of. I've seen that inside OWL as we've taken on some of our initiatives to be FedRAMP approved and RTP compliant. Does it come out of the IT budget? Does it come out of the engineering budget? Who's going to pay for what piece of that infrastructure? So there is definitely that inventory piece with the unclaimed equipment, unassigned equipment that you identify. If it is shadow IT, it definitely hasn't been patched because nobody knew it was there. And it probably and most likely performing an important function. So that is kind of the gotchas there, is the accepting that you're going to do that inventory, find stuff that you didn't know about, and then you're going to need a budget to modernize everything that you think you need to modernize to get it capable of being a Zero Trust endpoint.
What's the most efficient way you've seen these discoveries happen? Because you're mentioning different groups own different things. So do you like a tiger team, and then do you use, discovery tools? Just
yeah, you're going to need
good old fashioned manual discovery. Like how do you go about it logistically?
There are tools out there that will scan your networks and find as much information as they can about what's on there. Those often will trip a lot of the security software that you have out in the network because they're going to be scanning across the network. So there's definitely got to be some coordination across the different organizations. And a lot of times you'll get some falsely identified things. They'll
Mm,
scan an IP address and it'll show up that it's a Linux box and it's actually a really old Windows box. And
mhm.
so there's not only the kind of scans that happen, but there's the physical inventory and inspection that goes along with it to verify that those tools did accurately identify some of that old equipment.
So you do the automated scanning with a tool. Who in an organization have you seen take on this lead where it's been like it's just been a beautiful thing to see and it's worked really well?
Yeah, it's usually driven from in the corporate world, it's reactive.
Mhm,
Shareholders want people to have dividends. They want to see their stock prices go up. They
mhm.
don't want to see large investments in infrastructure that don't increase the bottom line. So there's definitely, you know, a reactive posturing in industry. If you look at what happened with a lot of the breaches, they knew they had old stuff out there. They just weren't funded to make those updates.
Right.
Um, in the DoD, it's a bit more draconian, right? The Pentagon can send a policy out, set some deadlines, and then create some consequences for missing those deadlines. Where in
Mhm.
industry, the government can't really do that kind of draconian stuff to industry, at least
Okay.
in most commercial markets, regulated markets, medical market. The medical industry, nuclear industry, things like that. Definitely, they have some teeth, but in most like critical infrastructure and things like that, there's not a lot of teeth out there.
All right. So it really has to be a cultural buy-in
Mm,
effort, team effort. Okay. All right. Step 2. Once you know what's on your network, you got you said it's time to segment. So you said you do this to shrink the blast radius. Can you walk
yeah.
us through what a smart segmentation plan looks like and maybe a time where you saw segmentation either stop a breach or totally fail because it wasn't in place?
Yeah, so the idea is that it used to be once you were inside the network, you had access to everything.
Right.
Every machine could talk to every other machine on the inside of the network once it was inside the LAN. Uh, so anytime malware came in, it had free reign to traverse the network.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a disgruntled employee could take whatever information they wanted and corrupt it or steal it. Um, so the idea of microsegmentation is to limit what people have access to based on the only things that they need access to. And the same with servers and applications to partition them off so that if there was some type of breach, whether it was an internal actor or an external, it would be contained to just that small segment.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually, when all your tools are in place, you can isolate that area off and either do a data recovery or send them off to a honeypot. It just depends on what what the organization wants to do once that breach has happened.
Okay. I might be asking too much with this question, but is it possible for you to give me um, an example network of
Hmm.
like a typical organization and give me some ideas of when you say you're going to segment. So you're going to segment like everything that finance touches. You will segment
Yeah,
that.
it's like
Okay.
the accounting system, right?
Hmm.
Um, you have the um, ability to commit fraud. So if the person that writes the checks balances the books, you definitely don't want that to be the same person. You want to have the accounts payable department to be separate from the accounting and things like that. So uh, you would make sure that not only the people that work for you that have gotten promotions don't have privileges. A lot of times you move across groups, so you verify the privileges of the people that they haven't carried some privileges forward from a previous position, and you verify that you've got that clean separation of roles and authorities so that you don't create an opportunity for fraud. Same kind of idea. The software that prints checks, if there's people that are balancing the books in the accounting department, you don't want them to have access to the check writer, right? And so
Right.
if the check writer is off off to the side, an open area, you don't want that either. So you put it behind a locked door, but you also got to make sure that from the network standpoint, nobody can get to it. And only the people who have the authority to issue checks actually have access to that machine physically and on the network. So that would be an example of segmentation.
Mhm.
Um,
And
it goes in,
do you perform the segmentation hardware based like a diode? So it can only do one way, like,
if the communication is such that, like if you're doing backups and things like that, you might want to push your backups into an area where the information only goes one way. If you have IoT devices like thermostats, humidity sensors in an industrial setting, a lot of times those are very inexpensive. Nobody really thinks about updating the firmware in those to address vulnerabilities. So they're pretty I would say high risk devices. You still want the humidity readings, you still want the temperature readings. So you might have a diode between that IoT network that just pushes all that sensor data into your enterprise for monitoring, but then you don't allow anything from the enterprise to go back out to those things.
Mhm. So is hardware separation the only way to do it? Is it necessary, or you can do some segmentation with software?
The diodes are good for really high risk kind of things. The and a one-way transfer, you know that the data is only going to go one way. Um, in zero trust for DoD, when you do the segmentation at that boundary between the segments,
Hmm.
they actually say there should be a next generation firewall if you're in a virtualized environment, separating the VLANs inside your hypervisor. And then out on the network, if you're going between physical devices, they want an actual physical firewall, next generation firewall sitting there. And what they mean by next generation firewall is that it's got a SIEM, security information and event monitoring, some type of tool that's on there monitoring things as it happens and can send some alerts if it sees suspect activity.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So you already talked about step three a little bit with the segmentation, but
Mhm.
our next step is access management and role control. So when we talked before, you talked about privilege creep, where, people move from job to job, department to department, and they're accumulating access over time, like digital rat pack or pack rats. So
Mhm.
how should orgs regularly validate who accesses what, and what is the risk if they don't?
I think it's not just the people, it's also the network.
Hmm.
You're going to create these microsegments. There's going to be problems. There's going to be a temporary solution to bridge gaps between these microsegments. And then they'll become permanent temporary solutions. And so I think there is definitely a need to go through and verify that the understanding of the security posture that's out there, that the work that was put into that is being maintained. And inevitably, it's going to be broken down over time, like I said, for troubleshooting purposes. And that there just needs to be like an audit, um, at least yearly, to come through and make sure that, that isolation is still what everybody thinks it should be.
So it's machines and people that
Correct.
you're auditing at least yearly. Is that audit manual, or it can be automated too?
Some of it, I mean, there is some automation that can happen, but the automation is not context aware.
Mm,
So, um, yeah, it will take some institutional knowledge to properly set it up so that the the actual security risks are being identified and the false positives aren't creating a bunch of work for people.
right. All right, we're to step four. You already hit on this when we talked about step one. and that's budgeting. Um, Implementing a zero trust architecture isn't cheap. So, what's your advice for leaders trying to scope and budget zero trust and without over over committing, under delivering?
Mm-hmm. I think if I was the CTO of a company that was profitable, the malware companies are really good at doing market surveys and figuring out what their next targets are. So if I'm at a profitable company, you're ripe for picking right by one of these companies. They're gonna figure out how to get into your network, and they're gonna do a ransomware or something like that. And then you know your job as CTO is probably over.
Mhm.
So if I was going to be a person in that role at a company, I think it's really important to assess the risk to the enterprise. Um, so there's nothing wrong with inventorying everything, identifying the cost potentially of modernizing stuff, the human capital investment is going to take to implement some of that security. If you don't have anybody that knows how to configure firewalls and things like that, you're going to need someone to do that, someone to map all your data flows out, set up all your privileges correctly and things like that, some security engineering. So there's that human factor side of things. And then when you look at actually the different maturity models and what your target is it basic, is it intermediate, is it advanced, um, what kind of timeline you're on, and then budget at least for a milestone. At least you can come in and say, I've assessed the risk. I think this is what it is, and this is what's going to take to remediate it. Um, you've bound the problem a bit, and it might be that more there's more money for you to do things than you thought, or there's less, and you're going to have to change your strategy.
So it sounds like when you're budgeting, you take these first steps, you identify the crown jewels, you identify the highest risk targets, and you secure them first and set your milestones to secure them first. And that can even be part of the segmentation, like you segment that first
Mhm.
because you might not be able to do the whole network at once. Is that
Yeah, I mean, if you have a lot of legacy equipment out there, in a factory floor, if you have a lot of legacy devices or bring your own devices, a lot of companies are virtual, and they're really virtual. People, are given their own budget to go out and buy their own computer, and
Mhm.
there isn't the concept of a company issued device that's really locked down. So that is kind of the highest risk is what's considered an unmanaged device.
Mhm.
I know it's connecting to my network from a person's home, but I don't know what kind of environment at their home they have from a cyber hygiene standpoint. So it's probably best just to assume that the threat is pretty prevalent outside of the area that you're going to try and protect, and just work from that concept that I'm not preparing for an attack from a 16-year-old in their basement with a hoodie on. It's a very well-funded team of malware, hackers that are organized like a Fortune 500 company sitting over in Eastern Europe somewhere.
Right. It feels a lot more manageable to do it what you just said, to identify your high risk targets and start to apply the zero trust principles there. It
Correct.
feels like it's doable.
Yeah, and you have to really look at there are some self-assessment things out there. There's kind of like a score. Just because you implement certain aspects of zero trust doesn't mean you've actually built something secure. So there was a pilot for an IoT as a water plant over in Europe. The Department of Defense or Department of War kind of took a zero trust approach to said, okay, we're going to try and bring some things in, do zero trust. We'll get to a certain point, we'll do this assessment, and then we'll bring in a penetration team and see if we can get in. And so um, the technical boundary that they set on the outside, the pen testing team could not get in from the outside, but
Hmm.
almost a majority of the cyber attacks don't come from a technical breach. It's usually a person that gets
Right.
compromised. And
Insider
so,
threat,
so
intentional or malicious insider threat.
right. So they get what's called a white card, which is assume that there was a social engineering type of attack and they got
Right.
privileged access to the network. Once they got inside the network, the microsegmentation that they had done really didn't. They put things on different IP addresses and they put it on different VLANs, but they didn't restrict the traffic between anything. So
Mm.
as soon as they got access to the network, they had access to everything. There's been other instances of that where some of the big primes have in reported out end of last year that they had prepared this zero trust in a box kind of approach, but then it was assessed there was really no restrictions on access once it was inside. So
Right.
you can definitely put all this technology together, but if you don't implement it correctly, you're going to get a false sense of security from having all that in place.
Well, let's talk about that. That's step 5. So the talent and sustainment. What's it going to cost? Or how many people are we talking? Like you shared with me that the zero trust in a box concept that the government has 35 different tools, which I think means 35 different vendors.
Yes.
So are like, do we need 35 different new people or
Well, it's a definitely a complex stack of applications that perform different security roles, um, all potentially isolated in different areas of the network under microsegmentation. So when you do have a problem, that does make it pretty challenging to get an overall picture of what's happening. Um, so yeah, there's definitely kind of the big challenge of implementation, but when there's a problem, you really have to anticipate, okay, when there is a problem, how big of an outage am I going to be able to absorb? And have I given the people that are maintaining the system the tools to actually go out and figure out what is wrong and fix it? And
Mhm.
if you don't have a way to aggregate logs securely or analyze the different faults that might be out there in the network, then it's going to be really challenging. I think the outages are going to become bigger as these kind of sustainment teams. It's a place to cut costs, right? Hey, we didn't have any incidents last year. We had
Mhm.
10 people. Now I think we just need 5. And then you actually have a problem and realize that you need 10 people to fix it.
Right. Is
Yeah.
it is outsourcing feasible for this? Like, are there
And that's
companies that do this?
Yeah, and that was my point about the funding. It might be that, you could do it in-house to meet your goal, but maybe there's funding to accelerate it or even outsource it.
Mhm.
And so those are definitely viable options. You want to, use a trusted partner to do those kinds of things. Vet some companies, and but it's definitely an option is to do there's even like a part-time CTOs, part-time
Right.
CIO options out there. So if there isn't the subject matter expertise inside the company to do that, you might even outsource a higher level position in the C-suite to help make that happen.
I think the vogue term these days is fractional CTO, fractional
Right.
CISO. Is there a repository of assets that people can go to, like a checklist or a plan or for zero trust that you would direct people to?
I think that the most regulated environment is our Defense Department
Hmm.
or Department of War. Um, So they're the most mature, I think, because they've been thinking about it the longest and have real strategy groups looking at it. I would think of that not necessarily as something written in stone, but more of a things to consider that they've thought about because they tend to overthink things and make things overly complex. but is a good starting point. They've got like a set of security controls that you can look at and see, do these apply to my organization, just like NIST does. They've got a checklist and a self-assessment to see, can I give myself a score? And then they've got guidelines for penetration testing that if you don't get a high enough score, they're not even going to bother coming and pen test you because they know you're going to be compromised. And so
Okay.
you've kind of got to get to that point of maturity where at least at a top level you think you would limit uh, the ability for a malicious actor to move across your network.
Okay. Before we wrap, anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
It's a journey. The the like I said, the Department of War has a lot of documentation out there, and they talk about the journey to zero trust. And it is definitely a journey. The threats are going to keep changing. The countermeasures are going to change. The technology is going to change. We've got quantum computing on the horizon, AI. Um, we've got considerations. Zero trust has started over a decade ago for our military and ICs, so a lot has happened in that last 10 years, um, and it's happening faster and faster, I think. So there's definitely going to be more changes out there. So looking at some of MITRE's papers out there on their perceived, threats that are there from giving an AI access to your entire network, just like giving a person access to your entire network is probably not a good idea. If you're trying to limit the access of a person to different pieces of your network, you want to look at AI the same way because it can aggregate that information and present it potentially to people that shouldn't see it.
I know you have a white paper on Owl's website. I will dig that up and drop that in the show notes too as a place to start.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for joining us on Tech Transforms. If you enjoyed this episode, please smash that like button and talk about it with a friend. I'm Carolyn Ford, and this is Tech Transforms.